Hey everyone, it's Johnny here, and I'm joined by Billie, who came first in the state in English Advanced. Hello, Billie.
Hi, Johnny.
Thank you so much for being here. So, Billie's done exceptionally well, of course, 99 out of 100. Is that right, Billie?
Yes, in the HSC.
So, I'm thrilled to have Billie here to help you guys watching with some tips and strategies that you can use for your own study and just to put you in the right mindset for approaching these exams. It can obviously be quite overwhelming, which I'm sure Billie can attest to, but there are certain things that you guys can do to make life easier for yourself. So, Billie, do you want to just do a brief introduction of yourself and tell us about that experience when you received the results and you came first in the state?
Yes, sure. Okay, so I went to St. Cath's, graduated 2021. And the main thing about like when I received the call that I came first was like complete shock. Just because I feel just like any other student, like I don't feel like I did anything special out of the ordinary. And like Johnny was saying before, there are some like students who came fourth in the state and things, and they also got 99. So it's like, it's not like there was something that majorly set me aside from anyone else. But I think, yeah, the biggest reaction was just like shock that like, if you do really like work hard, but not just hard, but like work smart in English, you can really like get the rewards from that. And yeah, just back to that point of when I first got called about that I came first. I was in Queensland, actually. I wasn't even in Sydney, and I was in the car, and I got this call from a random number, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to answer that. But then I was like, oh, okay. Like they kept calling. I was like, okay, I wonder what this is. And it was a woman from Nessa. I think it was like Louise or something. She was like, I just wanted to inform you that I'll just give you some exciting news and inform you that you've come first in state in English Advanced. I was like, no. I was like, wait, what? Like I was mainly just shocked. But um it was kind of surreal as well, because it's not like I was like in a place where like everyone was there, like all my friends or the cohort or anything. So it didn't feel real, because it just felt like something kind of like so removed from where I was. Like I was just by myself, like I was pretty much like by myself in Queensland. But then coming back and seeing all my friends like made it feel really real. And I just felt like was super, super grateful, because I know that like there's all those factors that go into it, like scaling in different schools and everything that mean you come first. But I just felt really grateful, because just like I was saying, like I don't feel any different from any other student, but it was like a really rewarding experience. And it's given me a lot of opportunities like this today. So it's been amazing. Yeah.
How did you feel coming out of the exam? Do you remember the feeling there, or was that
Yeah.
completely out of your mind? Because, some people walk out and then they're crying, and other people are just kind of like on an adrenaline rush and they're like, oh my God, I don't really know how I did there. Did you come out of that exam being like, wow, every question was exactly what I wanted? Or was it kind of a mixed reaction?
I do specifically remember coming out of like paper 1 and 2 for English, feeling like that was definitely the most confident I felt coming out of like any HSC exam. But it was also because I think I knew like going into it, like I had what I had like essays or like practice I had done. I had tried to make it like so it could fit like any question possible, and I was like really hoping for that. But like on top of that, I was just really lucky in that the questions that we did get, it actually really benefited like the like preparation I had done as well. So like it was good that not only I could have molded it to a difficult question, but it actually happened to be questions that worked really well as well, like for my essays. So I just felt like quite happy like afterwards, like knowing like I'd finished the short answers in the time I'd wanted to, finish the essays as much as I wanted to, and had a bit of time to like skim over them. And for mod C, for example, that's such like can be a bit of a curveball, but it was broad enough that I could like take a bit of, it was a quite difficult stimulus, but it gave us like the option of like any like form of writing. So I could take like what I'd prepared, but also like merge it with the stimulus as much as I could. So yeah, I was quite happy with like what we were given, but also I was happy with what I prepared. So I just felt really like glad walking out. Yeah, it was good.
Preparation really is the key word there, right? It's preparation. No one kind of gets lucky on the day and is going to
Yeah.
get full marks in things. You had clearly done the work to put yourself in a position to be lucky, so to speak, right? So would you be happy to just share some of that preparation with everyone listening? Because, I personally would love to hear what you were doing to begin with in the weeks leading up. Like when did you really ramp up the study leading up to the HSC? How many hours were you working? Were you doing English every day? What were you actually working on? And then we can kind of go backwards from there in terms of the preparation you did before even the trials.
Yeah. Yeah. No, just for the weeks before, I would say I definitely put a lot more focus on English compared to other subjects because it was my favorite. But yeah, even so, it was never, well, I don't know, like it's hard to, because I don't know how much like everyone studied a different amount. But for me, I didn't feel like I was spending like 12 hours of every day on English, but it did feel like anytime like I would do a couple of hours, and it was mainly for the last few weeks. It was like that, those memorization techniques and adapting my essays to questions. So it wasn't the most like laborious work. It wasn't like, oh no, I have to scramble together and like make a new essay every day. Like it was just taking what I had and just slowly every day kind of doing the same thing, but just getting better each day, just taking the essay, getting a new question, writing it out. And as well as like there was some things that I hadn't, like just was having trouble memorizing, like some paragraphs that wouldn't stick in my head, and it was just like going over that routine. So it didn't feel like, for the last few weeks, it didn't feel like overly stressful because I didn't feel unprepared. I just felt like I had to go through the motions of the final like memorization stage. So yeah, I'd say the last few weeks were actually probably, they were definitely the most stressful, but they were a lot less difficult than kind of the weeks, obviously the weeks before trials and leading up, when you're actually like creating all those essays and doing the hard work.
Yeah. So talk us through that process of drafting, because and how you kind of went with the memorization thing. So, I mean, straight up, was it that just memorize the whole essay, one core essay per module? So common module, module A, module B, you had one core essay, you memorized them word for word, and then you practiced adapting. Is that accurate, or did you do something a little bit different to that?
I pretty much did do that, and I was quite nervous because they do say to have, like, ideally you should have 2 to maybe 3 essays for each module. But the way I worked, and like I was scared that this wasn't going to work because there were people advising against this, to have like no, you should have 3 essays per module or something. But I had initially had about 3 essays, or 2 or 3 essays for each module, but I had found a way that I could merge all of them for every module, like merge it into one essay. So like one essay per module. But I could substitute out like paragraphs depending on what the question was. So this is quite like specific. Not everyone would have done this, but for a Tempest Tag Seed essay, I managed to like merge the main 3 types of essays of like imprisonment, performance, and then like virtue, vengeance into kind of one, where, for example, like through performance, you were liberated from imprisonment. But then if I needed to tie a feminist lens into it, I could substitute in a paragraph on feminism, but keep that same thesis. So it was, I did ultimately, like from an outsider perspective, I did walk in to the exam with 1 essay per module, but they had been like crafted in a way that depending on the question, I could substitute in and out parts that I needed. And every student works differently, obviously, but I actually, like, I would recommend doing that, because by having that, you're really familiar with your essay, you're really familiar with your thesis. And when you see the question, because you're so familiar with it, it's so easy. Like that's the most easy way to adapt, because it's like that thesis is just like, kind of sounds silly, but it's like the main thing within you, like that's the thing, that you have to ultimately like tie in with the question, and everything else just comes secondary to that, like whatever paragraphs you substitute in and out, whatever quotes, they all come after that, because the thesis is like the ultimate like kind of golden thread that will, for me, was there no matter what the question was, in a way.
I think that's great advice for anyone listening, is to have that thread, to know that progression that kind of works with any type of question. And to arrive at that stage of getting that thread, I mean, that might be inspired by what you're being taught in class, of course, or you're just your own understanding and really playing around with different questions and different question types, importantly as well, right? Like, would this still work with a question that was based around form? Would it work with a stimulus-based question? So I think having a look at those questions and then arriving at a point where you're like, yeah, I feel confident dealing with all of these different types with this one fundamental structure, even though I'm going to word it differently on the day, is definitely a smart approach. And it sounds like, you've obviously executed on that perfectly. So what about timing? Because that's another important aspect. You mentioned, which is really important, I hope people caught that in the last few weeks before the HSC, you kind of weren't worrying about drafting and cutting things down. It basically sounded like you were ready to go a few weeks in advance, and then it was just a matter of remembering everything, because there is obviously a lot to remember when you're basically memorizing 3 to 4 big responses, if we're including craft of writing, which we'll touch on after. But yeah, what was the relevance of timing for you in doing practice write-outs and cutting things down? What were your objectives when you were doing that?
I would say that the whole timing thing I learned I've learned like pretty much straight away from trials, because obviously for trials you have to have those essays. It is the HSC, but just within your school. And um, before trials, I was still memorizing like pretty much like the day. Like that was when I was like, okay, I didn't leave myself enough time to memorize. Like I was memorizing the day before, just hoping that like I was like, I really hope this is all in my head, because I feel like I haven't given myself enough time to memorize. And that was because I had only finished the drafting stage probably like the week, or like maybe 5 days before my actual exam, or in some cases like for maybe, I think I can't remember which module, but for like maybe mod A, for example, maybe I hadn't like completely finished it until like 2 or 3 days before, which is really like quite scary. And I didn't like that I'd put myself in that position. But that meant I learned for the HSC that I needed at least like a week out, because obviously I edited my essays again after trials, but then I needed like at the very least a week out to have for like each module to have that memorization, like time for that memorization process. And like one of the big things I would say is to never underestimate how long it will take to memorize, because especially if it is using material that isn't yours, that if like maybe you've crafted an essay with a friend, or you found some stuff online, whatever it is, if it's not your own words, it's not going to go in your head, and you're not going to be able to write that and adapt that. So I would leave like ample time for memorization, and then when you adapt as well, the words will change on the page. You'll forget your progression. If you're trying to memorize like line by line, the second you have to change a little bit to adapt to a question, you'll be like, I've lost where I'm at, like where I am now. So I would say for me, at least, I needed at least a week to have that whole memorization process of like memorizing line by line, then adapting to different questions, and then being able to like fluently write out the whole essay.
Yeah, great. And more specifically on the timing of each essay, or even the craft of writing, how did you approach preparing for that? Because obviously, from a macro point of view, I think you covered that super well. But what about the micro point of view of an essay where you have 40 minutes to write it? Before you started memorizing, were you timing them out and cutting them down until you got to a certain point? And if you did do that, what kind of time were you happy with for each one that would allow enough of a buffer to adapt to new questions?
Also within the actual exam, like the time management.
Yeah, time management in the exam. And how did you factor that in when you were preparing it? Because some people would say, oh, I'll just prepare a 1,000 word essay.
Right.
But
Yeah.
if you're a
Yeah.
slow writer, 1,000 words is going to take you an hour. So how did you go about that before you started committing to that essay? And you're like, I'm definitely going to try and write something like this.
Right. Yes. No, I see. I like what you're saying. Like the biggest thing I picked up just when you said was that um, it does always take longer than you kind of estimate to write out, like whatever it is, 1,000 words. Like you can write 1,000 words if you're just completely writing it out, not changing to a question, but you do have to give time for that like adaptation. And from what I remember, all my essays for each module, actually like module A, B, and common mod, were all, I think some were like, they were all about 900 words. Some may even have been like 800 or maybe up to 1,000, but there wasn't like anything more than that. It wouldn't give you time to adapt. And like adaptation is not just changing a couple of words. Sometimes you're going to need to add quite a few more sentences. And I know for the 2021 HSC, from what I like remember of the mod A question, there was a big chunk of like, it was like the stimulus was like a lot of quotes, and you had to include a lot of those quotes in the introduction. So my introduction did take up to maybe a page or half a page, like quite a bit of the page. Whereas my prepared introduction was probably 4 or 5 sentences. So I would say I made sure I would prefer to be on the shorter side slightly than on the longer side. But I did have a long essay, like I had a 1,200 word essay that I would have, and then I cut that down to 800 or 900, and I'd use that one for the timed essays. But then if I did need to add a couple more details, I still knew that longer essay, that 1,200 word essay, I still knew those extra details that I could add in if I realized, oh, I actually do have a bit more time than I thought. This question wasn't too hard to adapt to. But it's ultimately kind of just having a bit of like a memory of that longer essay, but knowing like inside and out that shorter essay, because it's unlikely that you're going to get a question that just allows you to completely write your pre-prepared essay, I would say.
Having that extended version that's a great strategy, because it's not like you have a whole new essay. It's not like you have these random pieces of evidence that you could add in. It's like I have a long and a short. I also think it's important what you're saying there is 850, 900 words, that's for you, right? Still for someone else, that might be 650, 700 words.
Yeah.
I guess, did you sit down and time yourself writing it out? And if it was at 40 minutes and basically you didn't even adapt, like, did you ever do a time to write out where you weren't adapting and you just wrote the one that you knew and then you saw how long it was taking?
Yeah, no, I did do that, just like with my phone with the clock next to me. And I would leave again, like I would make sure like it was 5 minutes less than however long. If it was 40 minutes that I wanted to write the essay in, I'd make sure I could write it in 35 minutes. But yeah, if I went over that, then I would like see where I could cut, or instead of just cutting analysis or evidence, whatever it was, it would just be summarizing sentences, like kind of cutting out the like unnecessary words and just making them as concise as possible. I feel like concision was a big thing I learned like after trials when I was editing, because you can still say whatever you want to say, but just in less words. And yeah, no, that I think that was a big thing, was concision for me.
And I think a really key thing for people to take away is that editing process, that refining, is kind of that annoying task where you feel like you're not getting a lot done because you might do an hour reading through your essay and you end up cutting out like, a sentence or rewording a sentence to make it shorter. But they're the hours that really count at the higher end, especially. Like once you've got that core essay, timing it, trying to make it more concise, tighten it up. Those are the things I feel from what I'm hearing, even from you and other people who have done really well, are actually the things that separate people. Did you feel like that in the lead up, that like you could go through for a couple of hours through your essay and maybe you'd changed around 100 words or something, you were just trying to cut it down and perfect it? Was that something you did for all of those essays and any other drafts you had?
Yeah, definitely. That was in that process of those kind of longer essays, like 1,200 words. And even cutting, it was difficult cutting 300 or 200 or 300 words, sometimes even 400. But it was definitely so beneficial because you would then not just have, like, you wouldn't cut out chunks and it would just be a shortened essay, but it would have so much content in it because you've managed to make it more concise, but it would still be like shorter in length. So it would have all the content of a longer essay, but without unnecessary words, really. So I did manage to find I could, for an introduction, make it 4 or 5 sentences, but every word that was in the introduction either connected directly to the rubric, was where I would connect directly to the question, and like amplified my thesis. There wasn't anything unnecessary.
And do you have any tips for students who are struggling to cut down their essays and responses? Like you've just mentioned a few key elements there that you've tried to keep, but did you notice a tendency that you might have had to include these types of phrases that just weren't relevant? Can you still recall like words and phrases or just general sentences you had that you realized, hey, I actually just don't even need that? Did you find there was a trend there? And what are your tips for students trying to cut down their essays like that?
I would find, I think it was probably, a bit earlier in the editing process, but times where I would like give a bit of an unnecessary like introduction to like a quote, kind of like, a lot of the times I find, I didn't do this too much in year 11 and 12, but I definitely did, year 10 or maybe early year 11, but I'd kind of refined this by year 12. And I know a lot of like my friends had like issues with this, or just students in general, is that like, you do need to contextualize a quote, but you don't need to like explain the narrative or like give an explanation. Like sometimes you can just like the way you use, I don't know, I found that like embedded quotes were a really big help for me, where like I would just embed it within my sentence, kind of like you could say like sprinkle quotes or filler quotes, but you'd still put the like, I would find that I'd put like the technique first and then the quote, and then the analysis directly. So I didn't have to say in Act 5 when Prospero does it, like I would never waste words doing that, because that isn't connecting to the question, it's not connecting to the rubric, and it's not any direct analysis. It's kind of just explaining the narrative, which I like completely avoided if I could. And they were kind of really, that was mainly the only like unnecessary things, because, and then if you have your direct quote, which is, I found I embedded most of my quotes, so I didn't have to give like an explanation of why they were there. But you've still got the analysis, like the techniques and everything as well. Then I wasn't wasting any words saying anything I didn't need to.
And what do you mean by embedded the quote, just so people can better understand that? Because to me, it's sounding like it kind of flows in organically, but are you still contextualizing the quote? Are you still telling people like what was going on when that quote happened, so to speak, at times? Or are you just going technique in this and then not saying who said it? Like how much context should you give to the quotes you use?
I found that there is like obviously like an amount of like context that's necessary just so it's not completely like you have no idea what is going on. Like the marker isn't just thrown into the deep end, like has no idea what's going on. But it's really just enough normally to say the character, and if it connects directly enough to your thesis, like it will kind of speak for itself in a sense. Like I found a lot of the time I didn't really need to contextualize my quotes. Say for common module, if it was from a poem, like I was saying, the quotes kind of spoke for themselves. Like I would say if it was like the final two lines, like the rhyming couplet, like it would then, and I would explain that it was like the end of the stanza or the poem or whatever. And my analysis would connect to like the sense of finality, if that's what I was talking about at the end of a paragraph. And that would be enough like explanation, like contextualizing to explain. I didn't have to say because my poems for common module Dobson, I didn't say like Dobson brings her poem to a close. I didn't need to do any of that. It would be the line and the quotes that I would choose very specifically would kind of, like I was saying, speak for themselves, and that like the content of the quote didn't need contextualizing.
So yeah, you were clever in the way you chose it, but strategic, I should say, in that you actually spent time really considering, okay, what's going to be the most efficient quote to say the point I want to say, also cover the plot element so it's pretty clear in itself what's going on, and almost order it in a way in the paragraph. I kind of thought that was implicit in what you said there as well. It's kind of ordered in a way that the marker knows we're going to go in through chronologically almost.
Yep, chronological, yeah.
Where that applies, do you think for the Tempest, Hagseed, for example, you did kind of move chronologically through the text basically, and then your themes kind of matched that as you went from the beginning to the end?
Yeah, I would say definitely for almost all my texts that was the case, because your thesis normally does, or mine did at least, but most theses seem to align with what the text is saying anyway, because ultimately, just as the text has like a main arc and a main like idea that it's trying to like portray to its readers, so will your thesis, and it will follow like a similar arc or like trajectory. And like that would work then chronologically as well. It wasn't like I was making up a thesis about something that didn't connect to the main ideas of the text already. So it would work with the flow too, because say for like Tempest, like Prospero's arc and like his like anagnorisis, that would work within my first two paragraphs. Say even it was like a basic virtue vengeance essay, you'd have that like vengeance at the first two and then that virtue at the last two paragraphs, and that would follow the progression of the text as well. And I found that when I kept it chronological, it would just work with the flow of my thesis. It wouldn't like mix up any of the ideas. It wouldn't bring it's good to bring a nuanced thesis obviously, but it wouldn't have anything that's too convoluted and would like make the markers think, are you repeating a point? Are you contradicting yourself? Anything like that.
How did you structure each one? If you like, just give us is it a 3-body, a 4-body, integrated, common module, module A, module B? How did you go about structuring those?
Yeah, so for my text, for common module, I did Rosemary Dobson's like poetry, and that was 3-body paragraphs. And yeah, like you said, there was a different idea for each paragraph, but like the thesis was written in a way that like each paragraph and each idea wasn't separated from each other, but it flowed on. So with her poetry, like her collection, some of the earlier poems were about like a youthful persona, and the later ones were an older persona. So I would take, for every essay I had for common module, I would take some of that youthful, like some from the youthful perspective, then like middle age, and then older. And that would then work with my thesis, because it would be about the process of aging or finding identity, or like a connection with nature. And that would align to her aging process as well. And that's where I'd find that like my thesis normally connected to, I guess, the thesis or main idea of the text itself, and wasn't too far removed from that, so I could follow that same progression. And then for Mod A, that was a 4-paragraph structure, and it was Tempest and Hagseed. And I did go, Tempest, Hagseed, Tempest, Hagseed. But for the first 2 paragraphs, I kind of had one controlling idea, whether that was, say, like imprisonment. Well, I did ultimately have one essay, but just for the sake of like argument, if it's just imprisonment, like just that like idea of imprisonment for the first 2 paragraphs, but then the idea of liberation for the second two, and that would be like if it was performance, whatever that form of liberation is. So then that would again follow that same trajectory of the actual arc of both the novel and the play, in that Prospero Felix is vengeful, but then they're liberated through theatre, or they're liberated through by God, or whatever the content is of the essay. That was a 4-body paragraph, and then mod B was a 3-body paragraph. And I did a text that not many schools do, but it was called The Hair with Amber Eyes. And that one was slightly different in that it was still mostly chronological, but it was kind of the main sort of, just like the main essay type, where it was like subjective. It won't make sense, I guess, if people haven't done Hair with Amber Eyes, but it was about like subjectivity, objectivity, and then a synthesis of the two. But I still, again, followed the kind of like the narrative, or it was a memoir, but I followed the like memoir form, like, and started with like the preface and stuff normally for the first paragraph, then moved into later chapters, and then finally the coda for that last paragraph.
I think that's really useful for people to hear. And, with Module A, some people do the 3-body paragraph integrated, but this also proves that the 4-body paragraph structure can work as well. So it's really, whatever your school kind of recommends, or whatever you feel most comfortable doing. And
I actually in trials did end up doing the 3-body paragraph integrated structure for Mod A, because I wasn't I wasn't great at timing at that point in trials. So I actually had to merge my last 2-body paragraphs into one, which actually, like, it turned out to be fine. But that is, I guess, it could be a tip. I wouldn't want like someone to be in that position where they're running out of time. But if you have body paragraph 1 and 2, I just managed to merge 3 and 4 into one and have a discussion of both Tempest and Hagseed in one. So like you were saying, it's really up to whatever your essay lends itself best to, whether it's a 3-paragraph structure or 4, because both work well.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great contingency plan, at least, as you said. If you are under the pump and you haven't had time to learn everything properly or time it, so you don't know how you're going to go time in, you can just do Tempest, Hagseed, or whatever your first text is, then the second text. And even though you wanted to do 4 bodies, you end up merging them. That's a great strategy, very practical, to just cut down and save yourself maybe 5 minutes that you didn't have. So I appreciate that advice as well. So all of that essay advice, it has been fantastic. The last thing I'd love for you to share is, what do you think it was or is that separates you as a writer, at least in the context of the HSC exams? What do you think you were doing that fundamentally allowed you to stand out? Was it to do with how specific you were with what you were talking about? Was it the progression? I'm sure it was a mix of things, but I would love to hear your thoughts upon reflection as to what actually separated you and made you stand out and put you in that high band 6 level.
I think I would say that like separation came really from how I answered the question, just because, this is what like I feel like must have separated me, because I know that quite a few girls like use quite similar essays, like people had like worked together on essays, things like that. So they're going into the HSC, there were probably quite a few, at least in my cohort, of like quite similar essays, all like very strong. But I know that something I remember that I did, and like I really focused on in trials, and then like even more focused on obviously in the HSC, was when I answered the question and using the stimulus of whatever the question was, instead of just using the terms of the question or answering the question in the first line of the introduction or the point sentence of every paragraph, and then sort of neglecting it for the rest of the paragraph and maybe just mentioning it once again in the link, I instead like integrated different terms of the entire question throughout the introduction, the paragraphs, in the conclusion, and I did that for every module. So that's why I would say I did come in to the exam for each essay with about like 800 words or 900 words for each essay, which is on the shorter side, but it was because I knew I was going to spend quite a bit of time including and incorporating pretty much every single term of every question that I answered for each essay. And
the actual terms versus the synonyms, like you made sure you actually said the exact words, albeit in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I definitely used the exact terms and then maybe paired it with a synonym a bit later on, but I made sure that I had addressed pretty much like not every single word, but every single key term of every question. And it was about integrating, say it was a quote that was in the question or the stimulus. I included different parts of the quote and make sure to incorporate like the entire quote throughout, whether it was in the different paragraphs. I focused on a different aspect, like maybe the start of the quote in the first paragraph, a key term in the next paragraph. But yeah, I made sure like throughout the introduction and with every, like within the introduction, within the 5 sentences, within every sentence, I did mention the question and the terms of the question and the terms of the quote if they were given a quote. And it did take me a while, and it did mean my introductions were a bit longer, but it meant that I could not be like, I feel like it meant it was hard to fault on answering the question sort of side of it, because I didn't leave any room for the markers to be like, oh, they didn't address this part, or they didn't really comment on the quote or anything like that.
Yeah, I love that. So make it impossible for the marker to give you anything but a band 6 on that particular point, right? How well did you answer the question? Well, I literally said something about it in every single sentence of my essay, effectively, right? And there are the key terms there for the marker to see that. I've used the quote from the extract. I like that strategy. Of course, the caveat being that you can't just repeat the question. You actually have to break it down. Do you have any tips for students on how to do that? So if the key term is a theme word, say it's like power or imprisonment, it's obviously not enough to just say that. So was there anything you consciously did to help you always engage with it on that more specific level, that next level that goes beyond just repeating?
Yeah, definitely. So if it was on a key term, which it seems like a singular theme, like if it was imprisonment or performance or power, in each paragraph, I would have a different interpretation or different take on that term. And that would come with what my kind of like pre-prepared essay sort of did anyway. And it kind of lent itself to that. But I still made sure that the topic sentence was never just repeating the terms of the question. I would include, if the term was imprisonment, I would have my own like niche understanding of what that meant. And I would like integrate that within my sentence, because when I had written my essays, I left like specific key spots in those topic sentences and throughout the paragraphs as well, that like lent itself to like not just putting the term of the question, but putting the term of the question and framing it to fit my thesis. So I wouldn't just repeat the question, but I'd like have my own spin on it. And I'd make sure like I answered the question. I didn't just, like you said, repeat those terms.
And just moving over to the craft of writing as well, just a couple of tips to students on that. How did you prepare that? Did you memorize some kind of composition for it? And how did you prepare for all 3 of the different types?
Yeah, so again, that craft of writing was one that I technically, like from an outsider's perspective, I did go in with one pre-prepared piece, but it was a discursive that had an anecdote that could be turned into a full creative. And then if it was like full persuasive, it was on a concept that could be taken in an argument in some sense. Like I could have like discussed like one side specifically and made it in a persuasive form.
Yeah, I understand that. And I think like that's a matter of just changing the modality for anyone listening. If it's a discursive and it's kind of contemplative, but it's not really assertive, the difference is, instead of saying things like perhaps this or maybe this, you say something more definitively like this is the case, right? And so even though the concept is the same, the framing and the modality and how definitive you are changes, right? And it's things like that I think is really useful for students, because they can cross over from the core piece. And, other people have said this as well already who did super well, that they had one core piece like you did, and then they've got the adaptation ready to go because they practiced changing that style and they're familiar with how to do a persuasive and how to do an imaginative. But yes, what else were you going to say on that in terms of the prep?
That was definitely the main point, was that adaptation was key for Mod C. And also because it is on the craft of writing, and most stimuli would like address that in some form, whether it was reading, writing, some other form of like creating like literature. I had a key motif in my discursive, which could be molded to either creative or persuasive, that was on like writing and the process of writing. But then it also could have been substituted out in a sense to whatever the stimulus, in case the stimulus did give a specific like motif. And I know for the 2021, it had a stimulus that said, I'm pretty sure it was like, use this as an extended metaphor within your piece. And it was an image. And I then substituted out what my motif was. Like it was about like yarning or weaving stories, and then changed it to, it was like a cage with a pencil and a hand. And it was like, it became like I forget how specifically I did it, but I just substituted out that motif and made it instead like a cage, and then used that throughout yeah, and so instead that was all it was. Like, it was just making sure that my pre-prepared thing, nothing was concrete, and anything could have been substituted out wherever was necessary, whether that was like a perspective, if they asked me to write in a specific perspective, like if it was a perspective of a character from a text we'd studied in mod C or mod B or mod A, I could have, like, I had a character in mind for each of those modules that I could have substituted that out for. And then again, with the reflection, that meant my reflection was quite flexible as well, that I knew where I would substitute things in and out, different quotes, but kept kind of that thesis the same, but I knew where I could, again, swap things in and out, just like for all my other essays as well.
The last section I just wanted to get from you, just before we go to your final summary of tips for students, is the comprehension section, section 1. Any strategy that you used for that in particular? How did you go about time management, and how much were you writing for, let's say, a 3-marker for 5 and 6? At which point, in terms of the mark hierarchy, did you switch over to doing more than one paragraph? And did you have an introduction and conclusion for those ones?
Yeah, so that was something I definitely had to do a lot of practice for. And I'd say section 1 is all about practice. Yeah, specifically the short answers is all about practice, because initially I would find myself overriding. I would spend so long on 3 markers and 4 markers. And I remember in year 11 in the prelims, I did that, and I wasn't even able to attempt a 6 marker because I had run out of time. So I found the best way to avoid that, or to overcome that, was, yeah, again, practice, but knowing that, like, I had to stop myself where it was like necessary. So I would have a structure for every single mark allocation. So 3 marker, it would be always that like introduction sentence, and then only like 2 pieces of evidence, and those were in each sentence. And then I would have to move on, even if I saw, oh, I like that technique, no, I'm not including that because I have to move on. I would do that a lot in the reading time as well. Like, I would read over each of the texts and then read over the questions as I read the text. And I know for the 6 markers or 8 markers, or those higher marks, they normally have a comparative. So I would say, if it was using text 2 and another text, I would make sure for text 2 I had like ample technique so that I could talk about some in the earlier question, but then again when I needed to compare in a 6 or 7 marker. And just with that structure of the 6 and 7 marker, again, it was always because we had Johnny come to our school to talk about this structure of the short answers. I would have always kind of one less technique, or like one less piece of evidence than whatever the mark allocation was. So if it was a 6 marker, then I would have 5 pieces of evidence. And anything over a 5 marker, I would do an introduction, 2 paragraphs, or 1 paragraph, and then a conclusion. So yeah, that was where that was the mark that meant, that was the kind of deciding, like,
the mini essay threshold.
Yeah, that's exactly, the mini essay threshold was a 6 marker for me. So I could do 5 markers where I would have, it's just in 1 paragraph, or maybe an introductory sentence and then a paragraph and a single sentence conclusion. But it was definitely the 6 marker where I would really make that more of a mini essay and have like quite a strong like introductory sentence or 2 sentences, and then 1 or 2 body paragraphs and like a strong conclusion. So yeah, that was really for me where it switched over to a more of a mini essay, was a 6 marker.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, that's great to know. And it's good to know some of the advice was working. But yeah, with the 5 marker, because that's one of the ones some people can do. I say you can do the mini essay even there, or just 2 paragraphs at least, and you could split it up. But it shows you can also do 1 bigger paragraph. Whether you always did 1 introductory sentence and then a topic sentence with 4 pieces of evidence. Would that be right? That's what you're saying?
I think that's what I did. Yeah, was that introductory sentence, that 1 paragraph that had 4 pieces of evidence, and then like a conclusion sentence.
Got it. And that's just 1 sentence. Like, people don't have to stress about the conclusion, just 1 sentence.
No, and that was just making sure. Yeah, that was just making sure, like, you really like ensured like that you show the markers, like, I have answered the question both in the introduction, that topic sentence, the link sentence, and the conclusion. Like, they again can't fault you on that. But it wasn't just repeating that question again. It was kind of like a nuanced way of answering it each time.
No, that's great. And that covers basically all the sections. So I'm excited to hear this. We're going to hear Billie's key tips for students doing the HSC. So take it away.
Okay, so for study strategies and just tips for year 12s in general, I would say the like main overarching tip I'd give is that English is different to pretty much every other subject. It is not, for like, the way I've approached it was not as a note-taking subject or a really content-based subject. I didn't focus on notes hardly at all. I took notes in class and just made sure I had all the content that we talked about in class so I could refer back to that. But I spent a lot of time doing critical readings. I read loads of exemplar essays, and I took like the ideas that they had and kind of like made them my own. Like I got inspiration from those ideas and then had my own take on them, and maybe sometimes molded the idea of a critical essay and an exemplar essay and just came up with my own thesis. And for each text, I found that my thesis was quite intricate and I spent a long time creating that thesis, but that was really because I did have the time to do that. I hadn't spent my time just writing notes on each text. I spent a lot of the time on like developing that thesis and having a really specific idea that was like completely my own, but I had a really strong understanding of the idea because I'd read critical essays and I'd read exemplar essays. That would be the main tip, but I have some small tips as well. So yeah, I would say for year 12 students in general, I would say a huge tip, and not just for English, for every subject for me, was to work together as much as possible, especially in like those more menial tasks like notes, or for say legal studies, like finding cases, or finding like we called it LCDMI, but it was just finding legislation documents, cases, and all of that. I would do that with a friend or a partner that has kind of maybe the same work ethic as you, so you can like divide up, you find these cases and I'll find these ones, because that's not the time that is actually technically beneficial to you in a HSC, doing the notes and finding like specifically the evidence. It's the like crafting and it's the creating, it's the drafting process that's the most important, and that's what I found the most important. So I would overall call that like working smarter and not harder. I would spend my time on the drafting and creating and developing a thesis, and I would have the menial tasks like note taking and like evidence finding. Like I would either do that with a friend or a partner. I would see if I can find like somebody who, like, sometimes there's some like notes that some people like have already made, and you can take inspiration from that and like use that, take out the key points from that. So instead of going through a text and writing like everything out, or just trying to just retype notes, like that is just not, that's not for English, I wouldn't say. And I would also say getting teachers' feedback is like invaluable, because something I found was I would like to try and like perfect an essay and be like, okay, is this good enough to send to my teacher? But by that time it was pretty close to the exam, whatever exam it was, and I would send it in and they'd give me feedback, but I wouldn't have time to apply that. So I would say writing an essay or whatever piece of work you're creating, send it in as many times as possible and get as many rounds of feedback as possible, and apply that feedback and send it in again, and just keep that process going. So you're always in communication with your teacher. You know exactly what you're missing, where your weaknesses are. And then you're quite confident going into the exam, knowing you have like crafted and perfected an essay that you're really happy with and your teacher's also really happy with. So there's less doubt and room for overthinking that maybe you have forgotten a part, or it's not comparable to other people, like other prepared essays that other people have, because ultimately they do want to help you, they're there to help you, and like they never, or they should, I've never seen a case where like they turn away a student for asking for help. So and aside from a teacher as well, this is something I did, was I worked with a tutor who had graduated like a year or two before, and who probably goes to your school, I would say helps, or who like had graduated from your school, because they would have done the exact same text as you, would know the teachers, would know the marking criteria, and it's kind of like a peer to help you, but they're there obviously like directly for you, and can really like find areas in your work that are less strong, or just need tidying up, because they know what the teachers like are looking for. They know that marking criteria, and then, I would just find it's a really good person to like kind of hold you accountable as well. You'd send in things to them and she'd ask me like, have you been able to redraft this? And I'd be like, true, I should send that in to you as well. It's just kind of like another teacher, but a teacher who's kind of like a friend as well, and can maybe give you some advice where like teachers wouldn't be able to, because they've experienced the same thing you have. They've just graduated, they've done the HSC, like they know the areas that are a bit more like a bit more of a struggle, and they can really help you with that as well. yeah, and other than that, it was just some like tips on memorization. I found that using a whiteboard to write out lines would mean you get that muscle memory of like each sentence. If there's any sentences you're struggling to remember that are a bit long, maybe like a wordy introduction, if you write that out on your whiteboard, you can rub it out, write it again. That will really help develop that muscle memory. And then something I did for every single essay was getting palm cards, memorizing a line, writing it out on the palm card, and then putting that aside and doing the whole paragraph or introduction, and then taking all those palm cards and going to a friend or my mum or my dog and just seeing if I could give it almost like a speech without looking at any of the lines. So I would say the line and check that it was right, put that under the card, and like continue on and do the whole paragraph or introduction as a speech. Because if you can say it, then you definitely can write it, and it will come to you a lot faster when you're writing as well. And yeah, those are all my tips.
Billie's key tips. That's fantastic. Everything you said makes so much sense, and I think people are going to really benefit from that. So, Billie, thank you so much. This has been invaluable for everyone listening, I'm sure, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, to share your wisdom. And congratulations again on receiving such a terrific result. And good luck with everything that you do going forward now. What are your plans now? Are you at university?
I'm just starting university now. I'm at UTS. And I'm just doing a double degree of law and communications. And with communications, it's like writing and publishing. So it does have that a bit more of an English focus, which I'm excited for. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, good luck with that. And thank you again. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for listening and watching. We'll see you in the next video.